The sound was wrong. Harriet Winslow heard it before she understood what it meant. She was kneeling in the basement of an abandoned farmhouse in rural Vermont, one hand resting on a cold concrete floor, the other holding a flashlight.
Still solid after all these years.
Tap. Solid. She moved a few inches. Tap. Solid again. Near the back wall, the sound changed. Hollow. Harriet stopped. The concrete there was smoother and lighter than the rest of the basement. It had been poured long after the old fieldstone foundation was built. There were ordinary explanations. An old cistern. A storage pit. A crawlspace someone had sealed years ago. Harriet preferred ordinary explanations. 40 years of welding, fabrication, and repair had taught her that most mysteries were simply problems nobody had examined carefully enough. She tapped the floor again. Hollow. Someone had covered a space beneath the basement. And the last man known to have lived in this house had disappeared roughly 4 decades earlier. By the time Harriet opened that floor, she would find an old steel ammunition box, bundles wrapped in wax paper, a ledger filled with names, and a deed describing land she had never known existed. But 13 days earlier, Harriet had not even owned the house. A few months before that, she had barely owned the direction of her own life. Harriet was 74. For more than 4 decades, she had lived with her husband, Dewey, in a house on Linden Street. Dewey had taught high school shop for 30 years. Harriet had spent most of her adult life working with steel, farm equipment, structural repairs, and whatever else came through a fabrication shop needing to be made functional again. Neither of them had lived extravagantly. Their house mattered because they had lived in it. The garage still held unfinished projects. Dewey's sewing machine sat in the den. His reading glasses remained beside the bed. Dewey had died the previous March after a long illness. For 18 months, Harriet had watched his world become smaller. Hospital visits. Medication changes. A hospice nurse several times a week. Some nights Harriet slept in an old recliner outside the bedroom because listening for Dewey's next breath felt easier than pretending she could sleep normally. After he died, their daughter Cassandra began visiting more often. Cassandra was a property manager. Organization was both her profession and her instinct. She brought groceries Harriet had not requested. Asked about medications. Asked how much Harriet had slept. Asked whether she had spoken to anyone that week. At first, Harriet understood it as concern. 8 months after the funeral, Cassandra brought paperwork to the kitchen table. A financial power of attorney. A healthcare directive. Just in case, she said. If Harriet became sick, somebody would be able to handle practical matters. Doctors. Bills. Accounts. Property. Harriet read the papers and asked questions. She signed them because she trusted her daughter. 4 months later, Cassandra returned with another folder. A real estate agent's card was clipped to the front. The Linden Street house had already been listed. There was interest from a buyer. Cassandra had found a 1-bedroom apartment near Burlington. It was easier to maintain. Closer to her. Someone could keep an eye on Harriet. As Cassandra explained the plan, Harriet realized she had not been invited to make a decision. She had been invited to hear one. "Cassie, is this about me being safe?" Cassandra started to answer. Harriet asked the rest. "Or is it about what this house is worth?" Cassandra did not answer that directly. She returned to the practical facts. Harriet was 74. She lived alone. 4 bedrooms were more than she needed. Closing could happen within weeks. Movers could be arranged. Harriet listened. She remembered Cassandra at 6 years old, leaving crayon drawings on the workbench in the garage. She remembered Dewey holding those drawings as though they were engineering plans. That child had not vanished. Harriet knew that. But trust did not make the situation harmless. She packed 2 bags. She took her toolbox. Furniture remained. Photographs remained. Dewey's sewing machine remained. His reading glasses stayed on the nightstand. The toolbox went with her. Years earlier, Harriet had opened a separate credit union account when a part-time welding job paid through a different institution. It was not a secret. It had simply never come up. There was about $9,400 in it. That account became the one part of Harriet's life Cassandra had never inventoried. Harriet left Linden Street. For 2 nights, she stayed in a motel near Route 7. She ate crackers from a plastic sleeve and searched cheap property listings through a public library computer. What happened over the following weeks is less clear in the surviving account. What matters is that Harriet kept looking. By late May, she was still living out of 2 bags and protecting what remained of her savings. She needed a place cheap enough to buy without anyone else's permission. That was when she found the farmhouse. 11 acres. A house that had stood empty for years. The photograph showed a collapsing porch, heavy brush, and a roof that had been open to Vermont weather for far too long. The price was $4,100. The property had failed to attract buyers before. Nobody wanted it. Harriet read that line twice. Nobody wanted it. She knew something about those words now. For 40 years, she had worked on repairs other people considered too awkward, too old, too corroded, or simply not worth the trouble. Some things truly could not be saved. Others had only been abandoned before anyone patient enough arrived. Harriet drove north. She bought the property. After the purchase, she had roughly $5,300 left. The photograph had been generous. Part of the porch had collapsed. Saplings grew through broken boards. One kitchen window was gone. The chimney cap had been improvised from rusted metal. Brush pressed against the walls. Inside, peeling plaster hung above damaged floors and evidence of animals that had treated the kitchen as their own. Harriet did not begin with the kitchen. She looked at the foundation. Then the joists. Then the points where weight moved through the structure. Some of the visible damage was severe. The bones were better. Old white oak still carried the floor. The fieldstone foundation remained surprisingly tight. Whoever had built or rebuilt the house had understood materials. That mattered. Harriet sat on the cold fireplace hearth as daylight disappeared. For the first time since leaving Linden Street, nobody was nearby. There was no daughter to reassure. No buyer. No mover. No one asking whether she was managing. She cried for Dewey. For the house she had left. For the life that had somehow become a collection of decisions other people considered practical. Eventually she stopped. The roof still needed covering. Darkness was coming. Harriet opened the toolbox and went outside. For the next 12 days, she measured time by what no longer leaked. She slept in the truck at first, with a heavy tarp stretched between the cab and the remaining porch. At a small hardware store, she met Gideon Marsh. Gideon watched her place fuel cans, work gloves, a pry bar, and tarps on the counter. "You bought the old Pruitt place." Harriet nodded. Gideon pointed past the cheaper tarps. "Use the heavy ones. Ridge wind will tear the blue ones apart." That was all. No speech about courage. No pity. Useful information. Harriet appreciated that. She cleared brush. Covered sections of roof. Cleaned the kitchen. Sealed openings. A used generator cost about $300 and gave her enough power for work lights and basic tools. Her money became a countdown. Plywood. Fuel. Fasteners. Roofing. Each repair made the house more secure while making the account smaller. Still, the work was doing something grief had not managed to do. It required decisions. A damaged beam did not care how old Harriet was. A leaking roof did not ask whether someone else should manage it for her. There was only the problem and whether she knew what to do next. By the 12th night, the roof above her sleeping area was dry. The kitchen was cleaner. One wall was sealed. A possum still managed to find another gap and wake Harriet in the dark. She sat upright with a flashlight in one hand and a metal file in the other. The possum stared at her from the kitchen doorway. Harriet stared back. The situation was ridiculous. 74 years old. Sleeping on the floor. A failing farmhouse. A possum in the kitchen. For a moment, she imagined the apartment Cassandra had chosen. Warm. Finished. Easy. Perhaps, Harriet thought, independence was only another name for making life harder than necessary. She let the thought remain. The roof above her was dry. 3 nights earlier, it had leaked. Fear could make an argument. Work left evidence. The next morning, Harriet went down to inspect the basement properly. That was when she heard the hollow sound. She returned from town with a rotary hammer. Gideon rang it up without asking what she intended to do. Don't drill through anything you'll regret. Back at the farmhouse, Harriet marked the hollow section. She worked slowly. Old structures punished impatience. Concrete dust moved through the work light. The slab was roughly 4 inches thick in places. When the tool finally broke through, there was darkness beneath it. Harriet widened the opening. A wooden frame appeared. Heavy planks had been fitted into the earth, roughly the size of an old steamer trunk. Across the top lay a thick piece of slate. A deteriorated rope had once served as a handle. This was not a random void. Someone had built it. Harriet worked the slate loose and aimed her flashlight inside. An old military-style ammunition box sat beneath it. Beside the box were 2 smaller wooden cases and what remained of a leather satchel. Harriet opened the steel box first. The gasket resisted, then broke free. Inside were bundles wrapped in yellowed wax paper. Old currency. 20s. 50s. Some larger bills. Harriet did not start counting. Under the cash were envelopes. Each carried a name and a date. Donnelly. March 1971. Faraday. September 1973. Whitcomb. January 1976. The smaller boxes contained silver dollars and other financial papers that Harriet could not identify responsibly from appearance alone. Another wrapped bundle contained government savings bonds. They all carried the same name. Walter Pruitt. The leather satchel contained something stranger. A small cloth-bound ledger. Harriet opened it. Dates. Names. Dollar figures. Page after page, stretching across years. At the back was a folded deed dated 1968. It described roughly 40 acres adjoining the property Harriet had purchased. She sat down on an overturned bucket. 13 days earlier, she had arrived with 11 acres, 2 bags, a toolbox, and barely enough money to make the house livable. Now she was holding a document describing 40 more acres. Yet the land was not the part that bothered her most. It was the names. The money could be counted. The silver could be appraised. The bonds could be examined. A ledger containing hundreds of names meant someone had been keeping a record. The labels were careful. The wrapping was deliberate. The cavity itself had been built to protect whatever was placed inside. Walter Pruitt had not thrown these things into a hole during a panic. He had organized them. Protected them. Covered them with concrete. And never returned. Harriet photographed what she could. She put the objects back. She covered the opening temporarily. The following morning, she started looking for someone who knew the area's older records. That search brought her to Eleanor Voss. Eleanor was in her early 70s and had spent decades maintaining a small local archive from estate papers, donated boxes, maps, photographs, land records, and documents families no longer understood. Harriet showed her several photographs. The ledger. The deed. One envelope. Eleanor stopped when she saw the name. Faraday. My mother's family, she said. The discovery changed in that moment. It was no longer primarily a story about hidden money. Over years of research, Eleanor had pieced together fragments of Walter Pruitt's life. He had arrived in the area in the late 1950s. He lived privately and simply. Evidence suggested he had access to considerably more money than his lifestyle showed. The source may have been family wealth in Massachusetts. More important was what he appeared to have done with some of it. The ledger began before the worst years of America's farm crisis. As financial pressure on agricultural families intensified, particularly toward the end of the 1970s, Pruitt seems to have acquired mortgage notes connected to farms in trouble. What followed was unusual. He did not appear to use those notes to push families off their land. Collection pressure eased. Some payments became nearly symbolic. Certain balances were eventually cleared. Eleanor's grandfather was a Faraday. According to the family account, when a letter finally arrived forgiving what remained of his debt, he read it twice. He folded it into the family Bible. For 3 days, he barely spoke about it. Harriet studied the photograph again. Faraday. September 1973. The cash under the floor no longer seemed like the most important thing Walter Pruitt had left behind. The ledger did. Perhaps it was not a record of what he kept. Perhaps it was a record of what he had allowed other people to keep. Their land. Their farms. The continuity of a family life. Eleanor could not explain why the ledger had been hidden. She could not explain why Pruitt disappeared. The deed raised another question. 40 acres adjoining the farmhouse appeared in old paperwork, but the land history was not simple enough to settle by looking at one sheet of paper. Harriet took the matter to Cornelius Bates, a local attorney accustomed to problems that crossed from property into probate, banking, and family law. Bates studied the photographs. His advice was cautious. The cash was one issue. The savings bonds were another. The deed was something else entirely. Finding property did not automatically settle ownership. There would have to be records. Notice. Title research. Possibly a survey and court proceedings. Harriet understood. Her profession had trained her not to force a part because it looked as though it should fit. She left the legal questions with people qualified to handle them and returned to the work she knew. The house changed through summer and early fall. Emergency patches became a proper roof. Electrical work was restored professionally. The well and plumbing became usable. The damaged porch was rebuilt. By early fall, smoke rose from a chimney that had been cold for decades. Harriet began fixing things for other people. A delivery truck. Steps behind a diner. A cracked stove. Farm equipment. Small engines. The town had watched the stranger who bought the Pruitt place. Now people had an opinion. Harriet knew her work. She was fair. She did not make anyone feel foolish for bringing her something they could not repair themselves. One morning in late October, she saw a wooden sign at the end of her gravel drive. Winslow Repairs. Welding. Small engines. Gideon had made it. Harriet confronted him at the hardware store. He barely looked up. Figured you'd get tired of explaining what you do. Harriet left the sign where it was. Not long afterward, a 15-year-old boy appeared on a bicycle. His name was Eli Farrow. He came from a family connected to dairy farming, where machinery was rarely replaced simply because it was old. Eli did not ask for a job. He stood near the workshop and watched Harriet working on a fuel system. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. His attention followed her hands from one component to another. When Harriet paused, Eli asked a question about the placement of an injector. It was not the kind of question someone asked to sound intelligent. It was specific. Technically useful. Harriet turned toward him. "Who taught you that?" "Nobody." Harriet held out the part. "Put it where you think it goes." Eli returned the next Saturday. And the Saturday after that. Soon he began appearing after school. Harriet never announced that she was teaching him. She explained what she was doing. Eli listened. When she did not know something, Harriet said so. The uncertainty interested him almost as much as the answer. A repair shop was forming around them. So was something Harriet had not expected. For months, she had been proving she could still manage her own life. Eli introduced a different possibility. Perhaps her experience was not merely something she could keep. Perhaps it was something she could pass forward. The mystery beneath the house did not stay private. A local newspaper learned about the discovery. The story described Walter Pruitt, the concealed cavity, the ledger, and the possibility that he had quietly helped local farm families. It did not need an exact dollar figure. The suggestion that the discovery was significant was enough. The article ran on a Friday. By Monday, 2 letters had arrived at Birch Hollow. The first came from a New York attorney representing a man who claimed a family connection to Walter Pruitt. The language was formal. Preserve the documents. Preserve the assets. Stop taking action involving anything that might belong to an estate. Contact counsel. Harriet read the letter twice. The second envelope carried handwriting she knew immediately. Cassandra. Her daughter wrote first about relief. She had seen the newspaper story. She was glad Harriet was alive and safe. She regretted that the situation at Linden Street had moved too quickly. The wording was careful. As the letter continued, it shifted toward the discovery. Substantial assets. Legal complexity. Financial decisions. Harriet should not have to manage such things alone. One phrase appeared near the end. Questions about an individual's capacity to manage complex legal and financial matters. Harriet placed the 2 letters side by side on the kitchen table. There was no evidence the New York claimant and Cassandra had anything to do with one another. Harriet did not invent a connection. She did notice the timing. Months had passed with no real contact. The newspaper published a story about assets. Within days, letters arrived. Harriet could distrust that timing without pretending she knew every reason behind it. She took both letters to Bates. He read them. His next question stopped her. Is the power of attorney still active? Harriet had left Linden Street. Moved her accessible money. Purchased new property. Built a different life. She had never formally revoked the document she signed months earlier. A call to the credit union confirmed it was still on file. The realization disturbed Harriet more than the claimant's letter. A stranger could threaten. A lawyer could demand. The power of attorney represented something else. Harriet herself had opened that door when trust made caution seem unnecessary. Bates prepared the revocation. Harriet signed it. Notice went to Cassandra and to the financial institution. The paperwork did not resolve every legal question. It settled one question that mattered immediately. Cassandra no longer had standing permission from Harriet to manage her affairs. 3 days before Christmas, tires sounded on the gravel outside the workshop. Harriet was working with Eli when he noticed the silver SUV. He glanced through the doorway. Then at Harriet. I should probably head home. Harriet nodded. Eli collected his bicycle and left without crossing in front of the vehicle. Cassandra stepped out. For several seconds she simply took in the property. The farmhouse no longer resembled the structure Harriet had bought. The roof was whole. The porch stood level. Smoke rose from the chimney. Neighboring vehicles sat near the workshop. At the drive, the wooden sign carried Harriet's name. Cassandra had last seen her mother leave Linden Street with 2 bags and a toolbox. Now she was standing in front of evidence that Harriet had built a life without her. "This is a lot, Mom." Cassandra spoke about the land. The legal questions. The money. She said Harriet should not have to deal with everything alone at her age. Harriet wiped her hands on a shop rag. The words were familiar. Safety. Responsibility. Management. Useful words. Sometimes necessary words. They became dangerous when someone used them to erase the person standing in front of them. "I got a letter from a lawyer after that newspaper story," Harriet said. She waited. "Then I got yours." Cassandra began to answer. Harriet continued. "I'm 74, Cassie. I'm not slow." Her voice remained quiet. "I spent 40 years reading plans where things placed close together mattered. I noticed timing." Cassandra insisted she had worried about Harriet long before the article. That may have been true. Harriet did not argue with it. Concern had never been the entire problem. "You sold my home before asking whether I wanted to leave it." Cassandra looked away. "You had an apartment chosen. Movers arranged." The farmhouse stood behind Harriet. No speech could have made the argument more clearly. "I revoked the power of attorney." Cassandra faced her again. "There is nothing of mine for anyone else to manage." For a moment, neither woman spoke. "I'm your daughter," Cassandra finally said. Her voice broke on the second word. Harriet heard it. The emotion was real. What Harriet could not know was what Cassandra was grieving. The damage to their relationship. The choices she had made. The fact that her mother no longer needed her in the way she had expected. Perhaps all of it. "You are my daughter," Harriet said. Nothing changed that. Cassandra waited. "If you come here because you want to know how your mother is doing, the door isn't locked." Harriet let the words sit between them. "But it isn't open today." Cassandra did not argue again. She returned to the SUV. Harriet watched the car disappear down the road. There was no feeling of triumph. Nothing had been won cleanly enough for that. She had simply done something she should have been allowed to do from the beginning. She had decided where the boundary stood. A Christmas card arrived soon afterward. The front showed a farmhouse under snow. Warm windows. Smoke rising from the chimney. Inside, Cassandra had written only her name. Harriet put the card on a shelf in the kitchen. She did not call. She did not throw it away. The legal work continued into the new year. Eleanor kept tracing Pruitt's family history. Bates dealt with the competing claims one document at a time. The man represented by the New York attorney did have a distant connection to Pruitt, but family connection and a successful legal claim are not always the same thing. By late February, the claim was withdrawn. The question of the adjoining land continued into spring. The old deed had to be reconciled with the property record through a formal process. In late April, with no remaining party contesting the matter, the proceeding ended in Harriet's favor. Bates called while she was in the workshop with Eli. She put the phone on speaker. When Bates finished explaining the result, Harriet repeated the number quietly. 51 acres. 11 she had purchased knowingly. 40 connected through the old deed. Eli set down the gear housing in his hands. "That's a lot of land to be responsible for." Harriet turned toward him. "Not a lot to own. A lot to be responsible for." The distinction stayed with her. Interest soon came from people who saw value in the timber. Selling aggressively could have solved practical problems. The barn needed work. Equipment cost money. A larger bank balance would have made life easier. Harriet chose another approach. Working with the appropriate local professionals, she moved toward protecting most of the acreage from heavy development while allowing limited use of a smaller section. Enough revenue could support the property without stripping the ridge that had survived untouched for decades. Harriet did not know whether Walter Pruitt would have approved. She did not need to imagine his opinion. The decision was hers. That mattered too. As spring continued, the barn changed into a real workshop. Eli was at the center of it. 2 students from his school sometimes joined him on weekends. Gideon found equipment. Neighbors contributed spare lumber or hardware. Nobody held a meeting to decide what the place would become. It happened through repeated use. People brought broken equipment. Coffee appeared. Someone brought pie. Thursday evenings became an informal gathering. Older residents recognized surnames from the Pruitt ledger. Names from their parents' generation. Sometimes their grandparents. Eleanor and Harriet eventually placed the ledger behind protective glass inside the workshop. It was not displayed as treasure. It was a record. Beside it, they mounted a small plaque. In memory of Walter Pruitt, who asked for nothing and gave what he could. This house remembers. Eleanor read it. He would have hated having his name on a plaque. Harriet almost smiled. Maybe. She glanced at the ledger. But it isn't for him. The families deserve to know that what had happened to them may not have been luck. Someone had made a choice. A week after the land matter was resolved, another envelope arrived from Cassandra. This one was different. No discussion of capacity. No assets. No offer to manage anything. She wrote that she hoped the house was warm. She said she sometimes thought about Dewey's sewing machine. At the end were 3 words Harriet had waited months to hear without admitting she was waiting. "I'm sorry, Mom." Harriet read the note 3 times. She opened a drawer in the kitchen. Inside was a small box containing Dewey's reading glasses. The buyers of the Linden Street house had eventually found them among belongings and returned them after Harriet contacted the real estate agency. She had never put the glasses on display. Keeping them nearby was enough. Harriet placed Cassandra's note beside them. She closed the drawer. An unlocked door was not the same as an open door. One meant there was still a possible way back. The other meant trust had already been restored. Harriet was no longer willing to confuse the two. By June, Eli Farrow turned 16. Harriet had something prepared. Outside the restored barn, Gideon's original sign had been replaced. The new one was finished pine mounted on a steel bracket Harriet fabricated herself. Winslow and Farrow. Repairs. Welding. Small engines. Eli stood in front of it without speaking. Harriet let him. After a while, she gave him the condition. "You finish school." Eli nodded. "Every credit." Another nod. "This sign will still be here when you graduate." Eli looked away for a moment. He went back inside and returned to the fuel pump he had been rebuilding. Some people handle large emotions by talking. Others need something to do with their hands. Harriet knew the type. Watching him work brought Dewey back to her in a way memory had not managed for a long time. A shop teacher for 30 years. A man who believed the best thing you could give a young person was a skill learned slowly enough that they trusted themselves using it. The thought still hurt. It also carried something warmer beside the hurt. By late June, a little more than a year after Harriet arrived at Birch Hollow, the workshop had developed a morning rhythm. Eli might arrive before the day's jobs began. A neighbor's truck would appear later. Someone carried in a broken starter, a cracked bracket, an old pump, or a piece of machinery that had already outlived its expected service life. Walter Pruitt's ledger rested behind glass on the wall. In the farmhouse kitchen, Dewey's reading glasses remained in a drawer beside Cassandra's letter. Above the barn entrance, Eli's name stood beside Harriet's. One morning, Harriet finished welding a cracked hydraulic fitting. She turned it beneath the work light and inspected the collar. The bead was clean. It would hold. Across the room, Eli was bent over a small engine, completely absorbed. Tires moved across the gravel outside. Another person had arrived with something that needed repair. A year earlier, Harriet had been treated as though age meant she could no longer be trusted with her own decisions. The farmhouse had been treated as though 40 years of neglect meant there was nothing left worth saving. Neither judgment had been accurate. The money beneath the basement changed Harriet's circumstances. It did not give her back her value. She had already begun reclaiming that before she ever heard the hollow sound beneath the floor. Harriet set the fitting down. Outside, a truck door closed. Eli kept working. She walked to the entrance and opened the door. Then she went to see what needed fixing.